So at the end of last time, we're left with a quote unquote skeptical doubt about all remote matters of fact. Um, that is, I mean, we figured out that in order to reach any conclusions about remote matters of fact, that was my shortened phrase for matters of fact beyond the immediate evidence of our senses and memory, right? So these matters of fact beyond the immediate range of our senses and memory, if we to reach any conclusion about them, we need some kind of general principle that there's a connection between effects and causes. But uh, Hume says, well, that principle that principle can't be, as we would maybe say, logically necessary. That is, it can't be a matter of relations of ideas because its opposite doesn't involve a contradiction. And we can't have learned it from experience because we just said all learning from experience relies on this principle. So, so then the question is, well, okay, so why do we believe in remote matters of fact at all? I mean, I guess you might think the question at this point is, well, so why should we believe in remote matters of fact at all? But I think like Hume actually shifts the question a little bit to why do we believe in them at all? Um, so, and this is going to be the skeptical solution in section. So that was section 4. And in section 5, the skeptical solution. And this is, so on page 30, near the end of section 5, part 1, this is the skeptical solution. All belief of matter of fact or real existence is derived merely from some object present to the memory or senses and a customary conjunction between that and some other objects. Right? So the reason we believe in remote matters of fact is that we have a proximate matter of fact, I guess is the opposite of remote, right? We have something that is within the reach of our sense experience, immediate sense experience, and we have like a customary connection between that thing and something else. And the something else is the remote matter of fact that we believe in. I mean, in normal cases, there'll be a lot of steps like that, right? But the important one is the first one that anchors the whole chain to something that I actually sense or remember. And then I can tack on lots of these customary connections. And again, I mean, I think Hume gets more confusing about this as he goes on rather than keeping it clear. And maybe that's because of the questions about the very idea of power in section 7. But about to get my thread. As I said before, like really, so in other words, if you say something like, I see smoke, right? So I'm walking by a house and I see smoke coming out. And I conclude that there's a fire inside the house that I can't see and don't remember because I've never been inside that house. So anyway, I conclude there's a fire in there now, so I can't remember it. Right? So what does it mean that I conclude that there's a fire? Well, so it really means that I conclude that if I go into the house, I'll see a fire. And if I put my hand near it, I'll feel the fire. That is, as I emphasized before, this is really about inference from effect to cause and then to some collateral effect. Right? Like one effect of a fire is it produces smoke. But another effect of the fire is that when I, put my eyes in the right relation to it, I see something. That's what I call seeing a fire, right? That's just another effect of the fire. So it's, and I mean, Hume makes this confusing because he'll often call one of the effects of the fire, right? So like he'll say, we, um, since, turn the example the other way around, or I mean, maybe not the other way around, but anyway, suppose I see a fire, and then Hume will say, well, since fires have always been associated with heat in the past, even though I'm not close enough to feel the heat from this fire, I'll reason from the cause to the effect. But again, what I'm really reasoning for is from the effect, that is the visible fire, to the cause, which is the fire, and then back to the other effect, which is, feeling of heat. Um, um, so, I mean, why is this a skeptical solution? Well, I mean, compare it to Locke. Like Locke also agrees that all our knowledge of remote matters of fact proceeds from the contents of our senses and memory, plus an inference to something else. Um, but Locke thinks that at least in some very limited but crucial instances, that inference is demonstrative, right? Like, I know that if something gives me the sensation of solidity, it will resist other bodies moving into its space. Um, um, but Hume isn't allowing anything like that. So it's, so the only basis for my belief in remote matters of fact is this customary connection. Um, I was hesitating until the last minute. What were the recollections here? I think I'm gonna, all right, so like that's basically part five or section five, part one. Section five, part two, which Hume begins by saying this isn't suited to all readers, so you may want to skip it. That always means it's really interesting. The philosopher says that you should pay attention, special attention to that section. They said just skip. Right. Uh, so part two is like an account of what belief is in general. Um, or rather, it's actually kind of an argument as to what belief must be if it's to be consistent with that conclusion. Um, so I want to talk about that, but I know that I often get bogged down in that, or maybe I shouldn't say bogged down. I get really interested in that, and I might not get to this important thing that I want to say first. So, I mean, because what I want to say first is just like generally speaking, before going into the details, how skeptical is Hume really about cause and effect and or power? Um, and like, I just want to discuss this briefly. First of all, this has been controversial for a long time. Um, the um, the first one I know of who strongly pushed the not so skeptical alternative is Thomas Brown. Um, I didn't write his dates down here, but his inquiry into the relation of cause and effect was at least the long edition, which contains a long discussion of Hume, was published in 1818. So I think he was born in the 1770s. So he was born around the same time Hume died. Um, but he's one of the earlier successors of Hume, basically. Well, I guess not that early, but anyway. Um, and, so he wrote in his inquiry into the relation of cause and effect, he says, well, my predecessors have all criticized Hume for being so skeptical about cause and effect and claiming we have no idea of cause or power or whatever. And he said, like, that's all a mistake. Hume doesn't say any of that. And I just read this recently on Facebook, the same thing, someone like Galen Strawson or someone has just published a paper saying like, everyone thinks Hume is like thinks we have no idea of power or cause and effect, but he really he says we do. Everything you've heard about him is wrong. Well, um, and I don't think those are the only two examples here. So, so like in support of that view, I mean, like this is at least the most important text, I think, in support of that view is at the beginning of, it's near the beginning of part 2 of section 7. Right. So in part 1 of section 7, Hume basically like section 7 starts by saying we have to find the impression from which we got the idea of power. And part 1 goes through various candidates for what that impression might have been and rules them out. And so at the beginning of part 2, he says, and as we can have no idea of anything which never appeared to our outward sense or inward sentiment, the necessary conclusion seems to be, and seems is italicized, the necessary conclusion seems to be that we have no idea of connection or power at all, and that these words are absolutely without any meaning when employed either in philosophical reasons or in common life. So that sounds pretty skeptical, except for the seems, which is italicized, right? And then the next paragraph begins, but there still remains one method of avoiding this conclusion and one source which we have not yet examined, right? So people who want to claim that Hume really never said that we don't have any idea of power or of cause, like this is a pretty strong text because he says it seems like we would have to conclude that we have no such idea at all, but there remains one way of avoiding this conclusion. Um, on the other hand, a few pages later, on page 51 near the bottom, Hume says, we have no idea of this connection, nor even any distinct notion what it is we desire to know when we endeavor at a conception of it. So that sounds like pretty strong in the other direction. Right? Say we have no idea of this connection and we don't even know what we wish we had. Um, so um, how to reconcile these two? I mean, first of all, this is like just one example of thinking something that happens a lot in Hume, I think, where um, you think he's taken some radical position, and then you see another text where it seems like he hasn't. Um, and I mean, generally speaking, the explanation for that is that um, um, he doesn't think skeptical conclusions are stable, right? Like he doesn't think that we actually believe them. He says they cause a momentary lack of assurance or something like that, right? They leave us confused for a moment, but we don't actually go on to believe them. Um, so, although there's also one place we'll see where he says, "But what am I saying? Nothing seems to me more strong than this conclusion I've reached just now." But anyway, um, so, but actually, I think, um, well, I mean, I guess that's going on here, but it's being supported by a particular ambiguity about what the idea of power is. Because like there's what the idea of power is supposed to be, and then there's what the idea of power ends up being. So like throughout the part 1 of section 7, Hume keeps like rejects these various impressions because he says the idea of power should enable us to do X, Y, and Z, or the idea of a particular power should enable us to do X, Y, and Z. And um, we can't do that in this case, so we must not have an idea of power, right? And what X, Y, and Z are basically like the idea of any particular power is supposed to include an exact idea of its effects and of the circumstances under which it acts, so that we could use it to infer the facts, right? That is, if we know the power that the thing has, is we have the idea of this particular power, then we would be able to know what effects it would have and when it would and when it wouldn't, right? So that's why Hume says, like, for example, sure, I have the power to move my body in the sense that a certain idea, like a volition, is followed by my body moving. But number one, I don't know, um, I don't actually even know what the immediate effect of the volition is. Because the reason my hand moves is because of all these things that happen in the nerves and muscles and whatever. It's not because of the volition. So if the volition is having some effect on how my body moves, it must be somewhere in my brain or something like that. It has its immediate effect is something I don't know anything about. Um, and number two, I mean, these are actually related, I think, as Descartes points out. But like number two, I don't know why sometimes it doesn't work. Both in the sense that there's some parts of my body that I can't move, right? Like my heart is a muscle, but I can't contract it. Um, but also in the sense that sometimes things go wrong and I may not even realize it yet, right? Like I just woke up and I don't realize that my hand is paralyzed. So or I have a palsy, as Hume says, but I think that means it's paralyzed, right? So like I don't realize that my hand is paralyzed. I carry out the same volition as ever and nothing happens. Why not? I have no idea, right? So therefore, like I don't have any idea of the power of my will, because if I did, I would be able to infer what's going to happen from that idea. So in the end, Hume says, well, we do have this idea, and the impression it's derived from is the um, the easy transition of the mind from cause to effect after a customary conjunction, right? So like after many times I've seen, and again, he says, I've seen a certain cause followed by a certain effect. But that really means like, um, I mean, or that's really supposed to mean, it's really supposed to mean that I see one effect of the cause and I conclude to its other effects. Um, And what I said is like, what may be part of the reason this becomes unclear later on is because, like, it turns out we don't understand what we mean by this thing that has different qualities. Right? Actually, all we mean is if we sense this, it's customary for us to imagine this. I mean, it's customary for not just to imagine this, but to expect it. Um, that's something that uh, maybe is not so easy to explain by association of ideas. Um, Sorry, my hip is like, what is it? What's the difference between just having the idea of heat occur to me and expecting it? So, I mean, and I think this is actually something that Kant focuses on in the second analogy in the Critique of Pure Reason, when he talks about how the imagination can present events in either order. Um, I think he's thinking about this type of situation where the question is like, how can you tell whether I'm imagining this coming after this or coming before it or coming at the same time? There's no difference in the images. Um, and that's part of like Kant's argument that we must know a priori that there's such thing as causes and effects or something like that. Anyway, but moving back to Hume, right? So the idea we end up having is based on the customary transition of the mind, the easy transition of the mind between things that are customary, ideas that are customarily associated. And we get the general idea of power, presumably because we have many such associations. Right. So the general idea of power is formed from the general impression of an easy transition of the mind. But now, like, notice that whatever we wanted to use that idea to infer is something, and I guess the idea of this particular power is formed by the easy transition of the mind in this particular case. So, like, whatever it is we wanted to infer using the idea of power, we had to already know. That was part of the impression, right? Like we had to already expect the feeling of heat. Because the idea of the power to produce heat, that is the power of something that looks like a fire to produce heat, is really just an idea derived from the feeling of anticipating heat when we see a fire. So power in this sense doesn't do anything that we wanted the idea to do. In fact, it's really not useful for anything, right? And again, like I think that's why this thing kind of drops out, right? Because the role of this thing was like, you know, if you ask Locke what's going on here, it says, well, we collect that in the fire there's a quality that is a power to produce the visible idea of a fire. And we also, by experience, have learned that that quality goes along with another quality, the quality to produce the feeling, that the power to produce the feeling of heat. But now it turns out that the whole idea of two qualities in a thing, and the whole idea of these two qualities in the thing was like formed from the fact that I already anticipated this. So that like the inference by way of the substance is like doesn't add anything. You can't ever add anything. So I think that's why it's true that we have an idea of power in the sense that in ordinary life, when we talk about powers, we're not talking about nothing. But that idea of power, when you look into it, is not at all what an idea of power is supposed to be. And so, like, as long as you're not looking into it, it works because you expect the heat to come after the fire. So, you know, after you see the fire, so like, it's as if you had an idea of power. I mean, that is like you have an idea that you call the idea of power, and every place where it should work, it works. But when you look into why it works, you'll realize it's not at all what you wanted, and it's not clear what you wanted. Right? Like, since we don't know where we can get an idea like this, we just don't have that idea. So how can we want it? Okay, so that's my like general explanation of what, so in the end, I mean, as I said, in the end, it's a version of that first answer I gave. How skeptical is Hume? Well, not skeptical at all when he's sitting in his study and he sees a fire and he gets closer to it to warm up, right? Like he's going to do that just the same as anyone else. And he doesn't think we're making a mistake by doing that, although there's an error involved. But it's not a mistake because it's unavoidable. I mean, so as he says, like nature hasn't left it to our irregular process of reasoning to determine what we're going to do. So he's not at all skeptical in that situation. But once he's adjusted his chair and warmed himself up and started thinking about philosophy, then he's as skeptical as he could be. Until he gets tired of that and goes back to doing something else. And what is that good for? Well, possibly not much. I mean, remember, he talked about that a little bit in the introduction. Like maybe it provides exercise for vigorous minds that that can't stand to just sit around doing nothing, but also like maybe it will help you sell books. Remember, that's what Hume's autobiography was about. So, okay, so hopefully I'm going to come back in more detail to the arguments about to the details of the skeptical solution and whatever. But now I want to, unless, first of all, other questions about what I just said? Okay, then I'm going to start talking about belief. So the question is, what is belief? And the first argument is, this is, and I guess I'd say the main argument, this is on page 31. Just, this is out of focus again. Driving me bananas. I don't know why that keeps happening. All right, anyway, so, right, page 31, that's what I was moving. Right, so he starts part 2 of section 5 by asking, like, what's the difference between imagining something as a known fiction, right? Meaning you don't believe it, but you're imagining it, and believing in it, right? So, like, what's the difference between, you know, like imagining a crow outside the window and believing there's a crow outside the window? Assuming I'm not looking outside the window. I guess we're talking about a visible crow or a silent crow. Right. So, and so the question is, does the difference consist in adding some idea? So we would have like, so like the belief that there's a crow. I think crow is an example from this story. Or is it a raven? I don't know. Anyway, some correlate. So like the belief that there's a crow consists in a bunch of, sorry, the image of a crow, imagining a crow consists in entertaining an idea, that a certain complex idea, right? It's a bird, it's black, et cetera, et cetera. Believing that there's a crow consists in that idea plus one other idea. Now, what would this one other idea be? Well, basically, it would be what Locke calls the idea of existence, right? Like you add the idea of existence to the idea of the crow, and now instead of just imagining the crow, you're believing that there's a crow. So Hume says that can't be the right theory. Wherein, therefore, consists the difference between such a fiction and belief? It lies not merely in any peculiar idea which is annexed to such a conception as commands our assent, and which is wanting to every known fiction. For as the mind has authority over all its ideas, it could voluntarily annex this particular idea to any fiction, and consequently be able to believe whatever it pleases, contrary to what we find in daily experience, right? So Hume is saying that, okay, if that's the difference, then like rather than imagine a crow, imagine an existing crow. Now I believe it exists. So it's just as easy as like, I'm imagining a crow. Now I'm imagining a crow wearing a little hat, right? Like, if I can imagine one, I can imagine the other. Okay. Um, uh, so similarly here, I can imagine a crow. I can imagine a crow with this other idea of existence, which makes this into a belief. So I can make myself believe there's a crow outside the window voluntarily. And Hume says we can't do that. Now, I mean, how do we know that the mind, quote unquote, has authority over all its ideas? Right, that's what makes the argument work here. If it's an idea, we would have authority over it because the mind has authority over all its ideas. And in fact, is it even true that the mind has authority over all its ideas? I mean, because later on in section 7, um, he says, our authority over our sentiments and passions is much weaker than that over our ideas. And even the latter authority is circumscribed within very narrow boundaries. So the mind doesn't have authority over all its ideas, at least not always, right? That is, you can't always imagine whatever you want to. And even more so, you can't always not imagine whatever you don't want to. Um, so, uh, so this principle seems kind of suspect. Um, and anyway, like, how do we know? I mean, this existence or belief idea is definitely a weird idea. I mean, it was definitely weird in Locke, and the way it was connected to the other ideas was unique, basically, right? Like it was a strange kind of connection. Like, why don't we just say this is one that we don't have authority over? Um, so I think, yeah, I mean, this is risky. This is like an example of me representing Hume as saying something that he could very well have just said if that's what he wanted to say, right? So but I mean, I feel like the problem here is like has to do more with what it takes for something to count as belief at all. That it has to be something such that the mind couldn't possibly have authority over it. Um, and also such that it doesn't follow from our previous ideas by the principle of association. Um, because like of the role belief is supposed to play in guiding our will, right? So like the whole point of having beliefs for a being that has a will is that um, like your volitions are supposed to be adjusted to your beliefs. Um, so um, So, number one, if you really ever had the authority over this idea of belief, then that wouldn't work, right? Like you couldn't adjust, like, like suppose that if there's a crow outside, then I want to go get a peanut to give the crow. So, like, but if there's no crow outside, I don't want to do that. So, like, I need that belief to be independent of my will if it's going to help me make my decision. Um, can I explain why it also can't follow from the laws of association? Um, the law of association is a law that regulates my own mind, right? Not the external world. So, uh, um, I mean, that is, uh, um, um, if this followed by the law of association, then although it wouldn't be my own product in the sense that I willed it, it would still be my own product in another sense, right? It would be a product of what I was thinking about before. Um, but to constrain my volitions, I need something that doesn't come from me. All right. I mean, I think that argument is weaker than the first one. I mean, I'm not as sure about that as I am about like why belief can't be, it can't be an effect of my volition. If it were, that wouldn't really be belief, right? It wouldn't play the right role in it with respect to my will. Um, Um, I mean, even though it's weaker, I want to add the other argument because because my point is, so then, like, if you ask why couldn't this be an idea, I think the answer is that, well, number one, a thing the mind couldn't in principle have authority over, doesn't count as an idea. And if you add to it that it's not an effect of anything that was previously in the mind, then it certainly doesn't count as an idea. Rather, it counts as what? Well, an impression, right? I mean, that's the difference between impressions and ideas. Ideas follow from my previous ideas and impressions, but impressions don't follow from my previous ideas and impressions. Or at least they don't have to, right? The mind can't make its own simple idea, but something can make a simple idea. Or in Hume's terms, with the making part of it kind of taken out, right? Like uh, a new simple idea um, can't be one of these faded, like low vivacity things that follow from the other ones according to the laws of association. A new simple idea has to be a strong, vivacious one that can come, so to speak, out of nowhere. So, and so I think that's Hume's conclusion. This can't be an idea, it must be an impression. He doesn't use the word impression here, but it says, this is the beginning of the next paragraph on page 31. It follows, therefore, that the difference between fiction and belief lies in some sentiment or feeling, which is the next to the latter, not to the former, and which depends not on the will, nor can be commanded at pleasure. It must be excited by nature like all other sentiments. So this is like an inward impression. I mean, it's the idea of an inward impression is it's a little bit weird, right? I mean, it's a way that I affected myself. Um, but so you might think, well, like it is at my pleasure, but it's not directly, right? Like I can't cause myself to, and in most cases, not even indirectly. So I can't like cause myself to have this sentiment or feeling of anger just by wanting to have it. I can do certain things that I know might excite it. I can think about certain things or whatever. But then I actually have to feel the sentiment. At least that's the way Hume thinks about it. So belief, and I think that's why he's calling it a sentiment. A sentiment is like, um, well, I think actually he explains this explicitly on page 41. The mind feels no sentiment or inward impression from this succession of objects. Right there, I take it he's using sentiment and inward impression as synonymous. I guess it, as usual, it depends how you understand that or. But I don't think that's supposed to be a list of two alternatives. That's or as in that is, right? The mind feels no sentiment or inward impression from this succession of objects. So a sentiment, I think, just means inward impression. So he's saying that belief is a kind of impression. And that explains why it's not subject to my will, because impressions are not subject to my will. Now, I mean, that still kind of leaves it kind of ambiguous, leaves something kind of ambiguous. So are we supposed to think of this impression as an impression that comes along with the idea? Because, I mean, for example, I think Hume thinks that, like, let's say, for some reason, crows make me angry. And so the idea of crow, like, somehow stimulates the passion of anger. That would mean that when I get the idea of crow, perhaps voluntarily, right? I imagine a crow, then I also suffer this impression, the passion of anger, the sentiment. So those are really two separate things. So that would be one way of understanding it. It's the one that I think is most um, immediately suggested by his language here, right? When he says belief is not an idea, but it's some sentiment. Um, um, and it's not, so, I mean, this gains some credence from something that Hume in general seems to think about sentiments or passions, namely that because like you might ask, what's the difference between imagining a crow and at the same time being angry versus being angry at the crow? And like you might think that according to Hume, there couldn't be a difference because these are distinct ideas and there's no intrinsic relation between them. But it seems like these sentiments or passion impressions are kind of an exception to that, according to Hume. Or I guess he doesn't think about it as an exception. He just thinks about it in a different way. But like, I mean, if we were going to read the part of the treatise about the sentiments or the passions, I mean, one thing that comes up immediately is the heart of Hume's theory is this thing about the double object. And half of the double object is that every passion has a certain idea as its like internal object, so to speak. So even though these are distinct, this one kind of can refer to this one. That Hume seems to think that in general about passions or sentiments. And so that would be good in this case because again, like we don't want this to be just imagining a crow and believing something. We want this to be believing in the crow. So belief then would be a sentiment which, like other sentiments, like contains an intrinsic reference to another idea every time it happens. Like it refers to another idea. Um, so, I mean, I used to think that was the right understanding of what he's doing here, although it raises various problems. But then I realized that in the appendix to the treatise, so, I mean, of course, the treatise is earlier, as I emphasized, right? So it's possible he changed his mind. But the appendix to the treatise, he explicitly rejects that, right? He concludes that, quote, belief only modifies the idea or conception and renders it different to the feeling without producing any distinct impression, right? So meaning there aren't two impressions. I mean, so there isn't an idea and a separate impression. It's like this idea itself feels different when I believe it. So it's, I think, like the right way of thinking about this is something like, um, every idea has, like, in addition to its, composition, if it's complex, out of other ideas, has this kind of belief strength to it. And whereas the ideas are the things that I can control, that are under my authority, at least sometimes, the belief sentiment that's attached to it is, it's, I mean, I think what it's really going to turn out is it's the idea's impression likeness. It's the extent to which the idea itself is an impression, right? Like, and in that respect, it's not under my authority. So it's not really two different things, one that is under my authority and one isn't. It's really two different respects in which the same thing is and is not under my authority. Um, uh, so I mean, I think that's consistent with what he says in the treatise, and I think it also in the end makes better sense of his argument in this section about what belief, how belief works. Okay, so belief is some kind of feeling that comes with certain ideas. Again, like the idea is under my authority, but I can't control whether it gives me this feeling or not when I have it. So what kind of sentiment or passion or feeling is this? So Hume says, well, we can't define it. I mean, I guess the point being, I guess that it's a simple impression or sentiment. So we can't, right? He says, I can't define it any more than I can define the feeling of warmth to someone who hasn't felt it. And he says, moreover, if you want to know which sentiment is it, he says, we have a name for it. The name is belief. That one, right? So, but he says, we can try to give a certain description of it. And I don't remember if I mentioned this before in this class before, but like description is a traditional alternative to definition. So like things that are indefinable for various reasons can nevertheless be, you can give a description of them, which does some of the things that a definition would do. That's, that goes back to ancient philosophy. So I think Hume is connecting to that and um, And apparently the function is of the description in this case is, well, I mean, I'll just read it. This is on page 32. It may not, however, be improper to attempt a description of this sentiment, in hopes we may by that means arrive at some analogies which may afford a more perfect explication of it. I wonder if this use of explication has some echo in Kant. I never asked that before. But anyway, never mind explication. So the point of the description is going to be that although we can't say what this sentiment is, we can show how it's analogous, how the sentiment of belief is analogous to other sentiments or feelings that we have and arises under analogous circumstances. And that will help us in a way will help us understand what it is, in the sense that it will help us like classify it. So, I mean, for sure, like what Hume actually goes on to do is offer a whole bunch of analogies. um, and I mean, the first analogy, this is something I already talked about last time, is to a certain aspect of color perception. And what I was arguing is that the aspect he's talking about is what we call saturation or chroma. So like, um, again, that's, if this is the color solid, like going around, this direction around is going from purple to blue to green, or back to red, back to purple. And this direction is going from white to black. Then the third dimension is like going out from this white-black axis. So along here, you have different shades of gray. And um, and as you go out towards the outer part of the solid, it changes from gray. Or it's actually easier to understand the other way. Let me say, when you start from out here, here you have a fully saturated color of this hue and lightness. Right, so it's like, I mean, I can call it bright, but that's the reason people have these terms called like saturation and whatever, is that bright is ambiguous. But it's like, you know, if this is green, and this is kind of like medium green between white and black, this would be as bright as that shade can get. And then as you go along this direction, it starts to fade out. And by the time you get to the axis, it's just gray. Right. So I think he's comparing it to that when he talks about like the brightness of a color. And that's, I guess, also what vivacity is supposed to be. Um, um, because I think he thinks that when you go around this way, at least, I'm not sure what he thinks about this direction, but when you go around this way, he thinks you get a different idea every time. Right? Like these are all different ideas. And that's why the shade of blue example, if it's really about hue, as I suggested, although that doesn't necessarily fit this text there as well as I might hope. But anyway, if the shade of blue example is really about hue, then you can understand how it works, because if you leave one of these out, then you just don't have that idea at all. Right? But this, I think, he thinks is a matter of taking the same idea and varying its intensity. There's also something weird about how they all come together at that one point. uh, which Plotinus uses not in the color solid, but like the center of a circle and the radii coming out to say that to show that we do understand how a simple thing can have complex consequences, so to speak. Like in the center, all the radii are the same. But all right, never. I don't think Hume is thinking about that. Uh, so presumably he thinks that this is discrete, just like everything else. And I guess there's just that one. Anyway, never mind that. All right. So going back, so um, um, so that explains why there isn't a new idea involved in, right? Because even in the color case, Hume is saying there isn't a new idea involved in going that direction. It's you're just taking one idea and varying its intensity. Um, so similarly here, there's like a dimension of intensity that varies back and forth without changing which idea is in question. Um, in the treatise, actually, and again, this is also another part of the treatise we're not going to read. Um, this is explicit. When you would anyway vary, this is book one. I don't remember what the parts of the treatise are called. Book one, section 3, chapter 7, or the other way around. I don't know. Anyway, it's 137. When you would anyway vary the idea of a particular object, you can only increase or diminish its force and vivacity. If you make any other change on it, it represents a different object of impression. The case is the same as in colors. A particular shade of any color may acquire a new degree of liveliness or brightness without any other variation. But when you produce any other variation, 'tis no longer the same shade or color. Right, so that there in that text in the treatise, the analogy is more explicit, but I think that's the same thing he's thinking about here. This shows, by the way, that there's something that this is another example. I mean, the shade of blue thing was an example, but the other axis is also an example of something we know about ideas, but we don't need experience to know, apparently, that they have this kind of intensity. I mean, that's actually one of Kant's synthetic a priori principles. That's the anticipations of perception. So that's actually like a big deal if Hume is conceding that. But I mean, he thinks it's not a concession because there aren't two different ideas involved. All right. Anyway, I mean, this analogy is evidently not perfect. I mean, it's not perfect because, like, of the very thing that got us here. I can imagine the color getting duller or brighter voluntarily, right? So even though this thing about its brightness or strongness is not a separate idea that accompanies it, still it's ideal-like in the sense that it's under the authority of the mind. Um, so like so this analogy only goes so far. Um, um, the other analogies are supposed to be better. Like the way my idea of my friend becomes stronger when I'm looking at a picture of them. So, I mean, it doesn't, that's supposed to be analogous to belief. It's not actually belief, right? Like, I don't believe more strongly that my friend exists when I'm looking at a picture of them. At least not normally, right? Like maybe if for some reason I was like, does my friend exist? And I was like, well, I have a picture. That's evidence, right? But we're not talking about a case like this. We're talking about a case where, like, yeah, I'm sure my friend exists, but like I want to look at my friend's picture because that will strengthen my idea of my friend in their absence, right? So So like Hume says, this is analogous because we have a present impression and we have something else that it's connected to by a principle of association. In this case, the principle of resemblance. In the case of belief, it's the principle of cause and effect, right? There were those three principles: proximity in time and space, resemblance, and cause and effect. So in this case, it's the principle of resemblance. Where it's the principle of resemblance, it doesn't lead to belief, but it leads to a kind of vivacity or strongness that's not under my control. And in order to get it, I have to start with an impression, right? So he says, like, if I wanted to strengthen my idea of my friend by imagining a picture of them, that wouldn't work. It would be like, I should try to imagine my friend, not imagine a picture of them. That's not going to help. Right? So, but the actual picture helps. Right? So you need to start, that's supposed to be the analogy with belief. You need to start with an actual impression, with a present impression, and then you need to, it has to be associated with something else. And then by association with that other thing acquires more strength or vivacity. Um, um, right, so I think that's supposed to be a more perfect analogy. Although at the same time, it raises the question, so like, what makes one kind of strength and vivacity belief? um, like, why does belief, and by the way, it's like, I guess one thing I can say about my previous interpretation is, though Hume doesn't say what I said about the role of belief in determining my will in that place. In other places, he emphasizes that. Right? Like, to understand what belief is, we have to remember that the ideas that are accompanied by belief have a much stronger and more regular influence on my will than mere imaginings. Um, so, but why is that not true when I see a picture of my friend? Again, unless in some case where I'm actually looking for evidence of my friend's existence, in which case it wouldn't be an analogy, it would just be an example. Um, okay, so but given those analogies, I think again, like we can understand how Hume is claiming this works. That is, why this way of looking at belief, like, although it doesn't explain why belief works the way it does, it at least makes it more familiar, right? Like, gives it a context to think about. It gives us a context where it seems more familiar. And he says, the way it works, so the way I understand it now is, when I see a crow, I have this idea plus maximum vivacity. That's what seeing a crow consists in, right? So that's an impression. So an impression has more vivacity than any idea I could have. Except when the mind is disordered. I still wish I could explain that. But anyway, never mind that. So, and then, but then the point is that it can transmit that vivacity to other ideas that it's associated with. So like, I don't know how to do this with the crow. I mean, I guess I could say, like, I imagine a visible crow. And I imagine a visible crow. So, I mean, sorry, I see a crow, so I have the idea of a visible crow. Now, like, I believe, I guess this is okay, even though it's future, but these beliefs can be future, past, or present, right? Future, past, or present beliefs all are formed by association with present impressions. So I believe that this thing is going to make a noise. So here's my idea of the crow noise, okay? And so this one has maximum vivacity because I'm actually seeing the crow. But also it's associated with this one by the relation of cause and effect. And again, the way we usually think about this, well, it turns out maybe like there isn't anything to this trip, like there's nothing here. But the way we usually think about it is they're associated by cause and effect because the same cause is supposed to have both effects, right? But however you look at that, anyway, they're associated by the principle of cause and effect. And because of that, this impression is able to translate some of its vivacity to this idea. And the stronger the association is, and whatever other factors influence this, the more of its vivacity it will be able to transmit to the idea. So, I mean, I guess it's also like, do I have other impressions that also transmit vivacity to this idea, right? Like, if you could, I think Hume could try to go into detail about the exact like plumbing system here, how vivacity is transmitted, in a way that makes it match like how we actually gather evidence to inform our beliefs, or also how we irrationally form beliefs. Yeah.
Does it transmit vivacity even if the crow doesn't actually caw when you're looking at it? Because I feel like I was strengthening like maybe false beliefs if you make association.
Well, so again, the belief, and I think, again, this is going to be a place where Kant is going to ask, hold on a second, what does it mean that it's future? What does it mean that you expect it?
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't mean that it comes with a little time stamp. Right? Like ideas don't have that. So, but leaving that aside, the point is, yeah, no, I don't form the idea that it's cawing right now. I form the expectation that it will probably caw, right? Because and so these degrees of vivacity are like degrees of belief, and they're never as strong as the vivacity of our impressions, which is why like our belief in remote matters of fact never reaches that level of certainty that we have in our present impressions. Um, but I can believe very probably that it's going to make that sound, because in the past they've always made that sound eventually, right? Like you don't usually see a crow being silent all day. Eventually it's going to make that sound. So and I also can believe that it probably made that sound earlier. So, if I'm like Sherlock Holmes, I'll be like, so we see that there's a crow. That means there was a cawing sound earlier in the morning, and therefore the criminal must have, right. Okay. So, I mean, okay, I think that's all I have to say about his theory of belief. It's, feel like I should say something about like, and it's a good theory of belief. I mean, but I don't know. I guess I'll just say it's a response to the same thing that people are always responding to when they talk about the concept of existence or actuality or belief. That like it seems on the one hand like it's a really important thing to say about something, whether it exists or not, or whether I believe in it or not. And yet when you look into it, it also seems like I'm not saying anything about it. So like, how do we put those two things together? And this is Hume's solution. Um, okay. So are there questions about that? If not, I'm going to go back and talk about the skeptical solution in more detail. How much time do I have left? Some time. Yes.
So for him, is belief just subsumed basically under, is it just a type of expectation?
Well, it's not always expectation. I mean, so like the remote matter of fact is obviously is not present to my senses now, or it wouldn't be remote. And it isn't even present to my memory. I didn't really bring in the memory here. That just makes things more complicated. I don't think it adds anything. But, you know, so it obviously isn't present to my senses right now. But that doesn't, so like that applies to everything in the future, right? No things that are going to happen in the future are present to my senses right now. But it also applies to most of what's going on in the present and most of what happened in the past, right? Those are all remote matters of fact. So, like, you know, if you go back to the fire and smoke example, you know, when I see the smoke coming out, I believe there's a fire inside the house. I believe it's there now, but of course I don't see it or feel it now. So, so it's a remote matter of fact. So that's not expectation, right? And similarly, like Hume's examples of like I'm walking in a desert country. I think by desert he means like deserted, right? Like desert island. He's walking in a country with no inhabitants, and I see the remains of pompous buildings. So, like, I believe that the country was once inhabited. So there, the thing I'm believing is in the past, but it's still the same relationship, right? I have the present impression of the pompous buildings or the remains of pompous buildings, and they transmit their vivacity to the idea of the people who built them and lived in them and so forth. So expectation is only one kind of belief in remote matters of fact. I guess I should say this also, in a sense, like one question is how this fits together with some of Hume's other skeptical arguments. I mean, we're going to see them in the treatise. There's a much less detailed version of them in the first inquiry, though, later on. But so anyway, what I was going to say is this explains why we always believe in the immediate evidence of our senses, because it's just by definition that we believe that more strongly than anything else, so to speak, right? Like that has the strongest effect on our will and so on and so forth. And all our other beliefs are only formed by getting some of that, right? So like we couldn't be more certain of anything else. The problem is that, of course, like what about the square tower and the round tower? Right? What about, you know, that can we really consistently believe that the immediate evidence of our senses is always right? Because it's not consistent. But I think, you know, from Hume's point of view, the question is something like, how is it possible for philosophers to distract themselves from this long enough to think anything else and not just believe it? Because they can't do it very long. Right? In the dialogues in natural religion, there's an exchange where someone says to the skeptical character, is like, well, we'll see when this conversation is done, whether you leave by the door or by the window. So, like, but on the other hand, you know, these skeptical arguments show that if you just reflect on that, there's this invincible, instinctive, and Hume uses the term instinct here sometimes. There's invincible, instinctive tendency to believe the immediate evidence of our senses. But when you reflect on it, even a little bit, you'll see that that couldn't be right. Now, I mean, I guess the question is, what's happening then? according to this theory of belief. Like, what do you mean? I mean, it still has all its old vivacity. What question are you raising here? I don't know, maybe I guess there's no inconsistency. What it is, this is the context. Maybe I should wait till I get to the treatise. But I'll just say, like, in context, what happens is that our normal belief is that this not only exists now, but that it's independent of my mind and exists even when I close my eyes or whatever. So that's the part that the philosopher throws doubt on. So there's something, there's like kind of appendix to this, there's the continuation of the crow, even when I don't have, even when I'm not seeing it, and that's really a matter of belief rather than present impression. And yet this connection is so strong. It's by all the, right, it's by resemblance and proximity in time and space and cause and effect. This tendency is so strong that that I normally don't notice that this is just secondary to the actual impression. So that the philosopher, when they notice this, says, oh wait, so I see, although this definitely exists, it's just an affection of my own mind. It's an impression. And then they invent something else outside that corresponds to it, the real crow. And sure enough, they say, but wait, how can we be sure there is such a thing? All right. Anyway, that's as much as I'm going to say about that for now. We have to modify that when we get back to the treatise. Okay, so I still have some time to talk about the skeptical solution. So actually, going back even before that, well, no, I guess not before that. No, this is section 5.1. So it is the skeptical solution. But it's part of the argument. It's the skeptical part, right? It's the part of the argument that all we know is that our only basis for calling something a cause and something else an effect, or for thinking that something that happens must have a cause, or whatever, is this customary conjunction. So this is the middle of page 27. Suppose a person, though endowed with the strongest faculties of reason and reflection, to be brought on a sudden into this world. He would indeed immediately observe a continual succession of objects and one event following another, but he would not be able to discover anything farther. He would not at first by any reasoning be able to reach the idea of cause and effect, since the particular powers by which all natural operations are performed never appear to the senses. Now, the way he puts this sounds like kind of like an empirical claim. I mean, I think there's something that sounds just like this in Locke that is an empirical claim. Right? It's that the inner constitution of things which explains all their effects never appears to the senses, right? So for Locke, that means that the inner constitution of things that produces all their effects is a matter of their microscopic structure. So like inside, they have little teeny parts that are all bodies and that have the primary qualities of solidity, bulk, figure, solidity, motion. Like if you could only see those, you would understand why it has, well, all its effects. You could understand why it has the effects it does on other bodies. Right? So, like, if you could see the inner structure of gold and the inner structure of aqua regia, or regia, or regia, or however you pronounce that in English, you would understand why gold dissolves in aqua regia. Because, you would actually be able to see how aqua regia has little hooks that go in here and pull the gold apart. Right? And, like hydrochloric acid can't do it because the hooks are too fat or something, right? And I mean, but Locke says, but if we had microscopic eyes, we could see, right? But we don't have microscopic eyes and they wouldn't be useful to us. And that's why God didn't give them to us. And so we don't know what the inner nature of gold is, what its real essence is. So if, at first it sounds like Hume is saying the same thing, right? Because we know the way this world is. If a person is brought into it of a sudden, we know they wouldn't see this internal structure. And so we know they wouldn't be able to tell why gold dissolves in aqua regia, but of course, if the world were different, or if people were different, like, I don't know how to tell which is which, but right, like if things were made of bigger corpuscles, or if human eyes were more sensitive, then a person brought in a sudden into this world would be able to predict what would happen. But presumably Hume actually means something much stronger than that, right? And of course, as usual, the difference is that Hume doesn't really think that Hume, Hume doesn't think that there are necessary connections between ideas of different primary qualities. And therefore, he doesn't think we know this about the structure of bodies, like how they can, in principle, act on each other. Like, we don't know that if something is this shape and there's a hole this wide, it can go through it. We could only learn that by experience. We'll see that Hume literally says that when he discusses the possibility of a vacuum in the treatise. Like, it's only by experience that we learn that certain bodies fit through certain holes. There's no necessary connection. So, so it's not just an empirical fact about this world, according to Hume, that we don't perceive this. Rather, like it's impossible to perceive this. I mean, in that way, he's agreeing with Berkeley, right? Because Berkeley already says all our ideas are inert. We can never perceive a connection between them. That is, we never perceive that one has the power to do something to the other. And therefore, actually, Berkeley agrees with Hume that we don't have an idea of power. Right? Like spirits and power and operation and whatever, none of those are ideas, according to Berkeley. So it's inconceivable that we would be able to tell something about what a body is going to do without experience of a body. Um, and, you know, because that's the core of the difference, that's why Hume zeroes in on the case of transmission of motion by impulse. Um, did I write down what that is? I've not written down where that is. But, it must be near what I was just reading, right? About the, someone brought into this world upon a such. Should be, but it's not. All right. Well, anyway, I may not be able to read it from inside the text. For some reason, I didn't put this quote in my notes. But, right, he says, you know, imagine one billiard ball rolling towards another one. And, um, um, now imagine that when this billiard ball gets here, it stops and nothing else happens. He says there's no contradiction in that. Or imagine when it gets here, it flies off in this direction and nothing else happens. He says there's no contradiction in that. You can imagine it. So you can't possibly know that one of those things isn't going to happen rather than this one stopping and this one rolling on. Now, I mean, this maybe doesn't quite get Locke at the exact right point. I mean, because I think actually Locke is, I'm not sure Locke thinks that we know which of those three things will happen without experience. What Locke thinks we know won't happen without experience is that this ball will get into this ball's space without this ball moving out of the way. So, like, at least one of them has to stop. But what's going to happen after that, I think Locke can agree we know by experience. Moreover, so, I mean, as far as that goes, I think Hume, although he doesn't raise the possibility here, he does raise the possibility in other places of bodies penetrating each other. And he says, well, we can imagine that in a sense. I mean, it really amounts to imagining that one of the bodies or part of one of the bodies is annihilated, but there's no way of telling which. So that, I mean, that's still like, how do we know that one of them has to be annihilated? Why can't they just be in the same place? Do we know that without experience? Also, I mean, but maybe this part isn't fair to bring up. Locke, of course, it's not like Locke thinks there is a contradiction. If there were a contradiction, then it would be the proposition would be trifling. Right? Like Locke thinks that propositions where the opposite is a contradiction are trifling. We don't learn anything from them. So, like the whole point, according to Locke, is that certain propositions about bodies where the opposite is not a contradiction. And yet we know with certainty that there's a certain relation between these two different ideals. So it's, I mean, Um, so although I think Hume has to maintain that this is inconceivable, like his arguments don't exactly get it, why he thinks that it's inconceivable. He doesn't exactly explain why one idea can't necessarily lead on to another idea. And like I suggested in Berkeley's case, that was because Berkeley thinks we can't have an idea of necessary connection without a power. And we can know that ideas don't have powers. But for Hume, that would be circular, right? Because he's trying to explain why we don't have, ideas don't have powers. That is, we don't have an idea of power. And I think it would be begging the question to say that that's inconceivable because if we did have an idea of power, we could see how one idea makes another idea necessary. And that's exactly what we're arguing about. Can we see that or not? So so maybe this part of the argument is a little bit unsatisfying. I don't know, that's not exactly what I want. But I guess I'll say, I think Hume can say something about this, and I think it would, but I'm not sure whether if he said it right, he wouldn't end up sounding more like Kant. That, you know, he would have to say something about how the senses can never put things together. And he doesn't, that is, he would have to sound more like Berkeley in the sense of saying that since it's not an active faculty, couldn't do what it's supposed to do here. And he might have good reasons for not talking that way. So I guess I'm gonna have to leave that up in the air a little bit. I was gonna say something about why Hume can't take Berkeley's alternative here, but I guess I don't have time for that, so I won't. Okay, I'll see you. Oh, important. I'll see you on, so Thursday night is a Jewish holiday. This is on the syllabus, but I should remind you of this, right? Thursday night is a Jewish holiday, so we won't be having class. And there'll be a makeup class via Zoom on Monday, and then back to the regular schedule on Tuesday. Okay, see you then.